The year was 1924, and fur trapper Jess Sethington had decided to make his way up to the headwaters of the Uinta River without the companionship of another person. People venturing into the isolated backcountry of Alaska have an unwritten rule, and that was to never go alone. But Jess didn't heed that advice. He was very experienced, after all, and his trip was not supposed to be long in duration. Jess didn't return when scheduled, and 4 of his woodsman friends began the tracking process. They located several of his campsites, and then all the signs of the trapper disappeared. About 9 years later, gold miners and brothers Jack and Bruce Johnstone and their trusty dog Slasher had decided to trek to the productive headwaters of the Uinta River. The labor of the day was exhausting yet rewarding, as the remote area was largely untapped and begrudgingly yielding its gold in exchange for sweat and blood. As the weary men finished up their dinner around the campfire, they heard a distant noise, a drawn-out noise, unlike anything the experienced outdoorsmen had ever heard. They knew the sounds of every animal in the wild, and this noise was definitely strange to them. Slasher's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl as he stared into the blackness beyond the light of the campfire. Their profiles glimmered in the fireglow as they listened and waited. Suddenly the deep moan was closer and more definite. It haunted the darkness of the woods and made their hair stand on end. The waiting and listening only added to the tension. The men checked the actions of their firearms and added more firewood to the campfire. The noise eventually waned, and the miners retired to salvage what sleep they could for the night. The next year, the brothers made the same treacherous journey and decided to explore an area called Sulphide Creek. In the canyon at the headwaters of the creek, the men observed a giant brown bear on the far side of the creek. Upon seeing the men, the bear made a straight line toward them. Jack immediately emptied his rifle into the charging Bruin, but the bear made it across the raging creek and lifted itself up onto the bank, despite an obviously broken back. Jack then pulled his sidearm and completely emptied the gun into the bear just before it slipped on the bank and tumbled into the raging current to be swept away. Upon returning downstream to their boat, the men found the oars splintered and their boat with a gaping hole in the hull. All of this damage was apparently done by a bear. The Johnstone brothers returned the next year and pitched a temporary camp in a flat area and started setting up their sleeping arrangements. In the middle of the night, Jack was awakened to see a giant dark shape silently approach him while he was in his sleeping bag. He slowly reached for his rifle, but Slasher flashed to their defense. The dog and bear hastily chased each other in the bush, surrounded by a cacophonous eruption of barking, growling, and gravel and bushes snapping. Later in the fall of the same year, the men investigated the river shore near the camp and found it strewn with partially consumed salmon carcasses and bear scat and tracks. The previous night, they were stirred from slumber by the now familiar and eerie groaning noises, which faded as the animal departed the area. The brothers went to examine a discovered quartz deposit near the camp. As they returned to camp, Slasher raced into the bushes immediately, behind where they had just spent a considerable amount of time examining the quartz deposit. They could not see the bear, but heard the growling and saw the bushes thrashing as the bear and Slasher confronted each other. Immediately following the incident, the familiar groaning started up once again, as the bear was persuaded to leave. The brothers had to seriously consider the possibility that the bear had been silently lying in ambush for them to get within striking distance. The next summer, the brothers returned with their friend George and their reliable protector, Slasher. Bruce decided to quickly examine the quartz deposit again and left his rifle in the boat. While pushing his way through the tangled underbrush, Bruce heard a loud snort near the trail. The bear charged, but remained in the dense cover, which was shaking in the footfalls of the giant man-killer. As the bear assessed how to kill the man, but remained protected by the foliage, he started the familiar and drawn-out groaning, so familiar now to the men. Armed only with a .410 pistol for protection, Bruce backed down the trail while alternately firing over the bushes and reloading the firearm. The charging bear stopped his charge temporarily, only to resume the charge with more anger and speed than before. Each time Bruce fired his pistol, the bear would pause its charge, giving him a few seconds to reload and fire again once the bear continued the pursuit. Each time the man fired over the bushes, the bear would cough and snort and then moan. This awkward pursuit continued until the pair reached the boat anchored on the shore of the river. The bear always managed to keep enough cover between him and his prey to keep from being shot. Bruce finally dashed across the beach and grabbed his rifle. He spun around ready to dispatch his pursuer, but the bear remained concealed in the brush. For the next 30 minutes, the bear paced and stomped back and forth and groaned. They now knew the bear was trying to ambush them, and was not afraid of an armed man. Later in the fall of that same year, the brothers returned to the area and worked hard to complete a small cabin to shelter themselves. They fell a few cottonwoods and arranged them in a protective yet very preliminary foundation of a cabin. They kept the fire roaring, but the bear returned several times through the night and moaned that sorrowful and tortured regret each time. Slasher would chase him back into the bush, but the bear seemed to grow in boldness in a desperate escalation. The brothers continually held back, using their firearms until they could get a certain kill shot, but the darkness provided the obscurity the bear needed. The last thing they wanted was a wounded and aggressive bear to deal with. The sun finally revealed a safer situation, and the men immediately chugged their coffee and commenced working feverishly on their cabin. After making a satisfactory amount of progress, Bruce decided to stake out their mining claim to ward off competing miners. As he was carving out a stake from a small tree stump, Slasher growled and dashed past him in a blur of fur and teeth. Bruce quickly pivoted and was stunned by the sight of a gigantic, one-eyed bear. Bruce grabbed his rifle and fired from the hip. The bear was mere feet from the end of his rifle barrel, and the bullet found purchase in the bear's massive shoulder. Between the impact of the bullet and the kick of the rifle, the bear and the man were pushed out of the path of one another, and the bear blurred past Bruce. The massive blur of enraged bear piled up just past the man and let out a low and long groan. As the bear regained his feet and turned to charge again, Bruce fired and struck him in the neck. Again, the man-killer collapsed. Incredibly, the bear struggled to its feet again, and this time Bruce placed one of his few remaining bullets just behind the bear's ear, bringing its fury to an end. The bear lay dead at Bruce's feet. Bruce could not believe the size nor the condition of the bear. The deformed mass of the bear was frightening. Bruce observed that the giant bear had thick, leather-like skin with patches of fur and was deformed in its face. The bear was missing its right eye, which was grown over with scar tissue. Its snout was painfully twisted, with several of its mostly rotten teeth missing and infected. Realizing his lack of ammunition, Bruce called Slasher, and the pair returned to camp. The other two men in the mining camp returned to the carcass to stare in awe and wonder at the massive and deformed man-killer. They hacked its deformed head, as well as its 10-inch wide paws, from its carcass, and departed to finish the season with a great amount of peace of mind. Back at camp, Bruce skinned the bear's head, and the culmination of their experiences started to make sense. The bear's right eye socket had at some point prior been shattered by a bullet and healed over. Just above the right eye was another bullet that was in a state of healing as well. A third bullet had grazed the base of the bear's skull, the right jaw socket had been obliterated by at least one bullet, and the bones of the bear's jaw did not meet, nor had they healed. They remained infected and decaying as the bear lived on. Below the bear's jaw rested two .33 caliber bullets, and in the gristle of the jaw he discovered three .38 caliber bullets from a pistol. The disappearance of Jess Sethington flashed back to Bruce's mind, and he shuddered at the realization of the position the man had to be in to fire the bullets into the bear at that angle. The following year, the men returned to the location of the carcass and examined the bear's remains, now only bones. Bruce found that 4 of the bear's vertebrae had fused together into a single vertebrae just over 8 inches in length. The giant bear's back had been broken, and the 2 adjoining ribs had grown together and fused with each other. Could this be the same bear that charged the brothers from across the creek and was washed downstream in the raging current? Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the rugged Sierra Nevada mountains in central California. The Sierra Nevadas are one of the highest and most prestigious mountain ranges in the world, and serve as the spine of California, running from the Mexican border all the way to around the Oregon border. The giant granite peaks seem to touch the sky and host hundreds of miles of largely uninterrupted fir and pine forests. At the time of our incident, there were no highways crossing the mountain passes, and assistance was often too far away to actually help. John Adams was born in 1812 in Medway, Massachusetts, and made his way to California when he was 37 years old, after his shoe business failed due to fire. He left his family and made his way to the wilds of California to become a trapper, miner, and hunter. Having nearly died from 2 illnesses during his trek, he arrived in California in mid-December. He utilized his knowledge gained as an animal trainer and hunter in New England to make his own buckskins, moccasins, harness, saddles, and snowshoes. and with help from the Miwok Indians built a cabin and stable to winter over. In 1853, he navigated around 1,200 miles on one of his hunting and trapping expeditions, clear up to the eastern portion of the Washington Territory. While out on an excursion, he discovered a female yearling cub and quickly caught her. He moonlighted as an animal trainer and would sometimes catch animals and sell them to circuses or other menageries. He named the young grizzly Lady Washington. Incredibly, he eventually tamed Lady Washington and she became his constant sidekick. He even rode on her back, and she cuddled him in freezing conditions to keep him warm. Later on, Lady Washington would have a tryst in the Rocky Mountains, and eventually have a cub Adams would name General Fremont. A year later, Grizzly, as he came to be known, pulled two 2-week-old cubs from a grizzly sow's den while she hibernated in the Yosemite Valley. He raised the cubs himself, and one of them stuck around long enough to be named Ben, after Benjamin Franklin. Adams and Ben were quickly inseparable, and Ben would follow Adams anywhere he went. The odd couple were once traveling through the Sierra Nevadas and came across a sow with 3 cubs. This sow was first of all offended that there was a man nearby, and compounding her offense, a boar bear to boot. The sow rushed Adams and quickly swatted his rifle out of his hands with her left paw before he had a chance to fire. Then with her right paw, knocked him flailing, landing face down. She then dug her huge canines into the flesh of his back and tore flesh, buckskin, and flannel shirt from his body. Just in the nick of time, the yearling Ben joined the fight and chomped onto her haunches. She spun around and dug her teeth into Ben's skull, blinding him in one of his eyes. Then she used her paws to crush him into the ground while she brutally bit into his shoulder to lift him off the ground and shake him violently back and forth. The wounded Adams had the luxury of watching the 2 bears square off, but the heartbreak of watching his best friend Ben be wounded and beaten. By then, the man had gathered himself enough to lift his rifle and drive a bullet home through the sow's heart, stopping the brutality for once and for all. Ben healed eventually, and the 2 continued on with their life in the woods. The record does not indicate what became of her 3 cubs, but I assume Adams merged them into his menagerie. A few months later, Adams and Ben were ambushed again, and this time the bear got to Adams before Ben could stop the violence. The bear surprised Adams as he rounded a bend in the trail and quickly slapped him upside his head, knocking him down and gashing his scalp. Then the bear began tearing his scalp from his head while punching a hole in his skull the size of a silver dollar. The attack was over as quickly as it had started, as the large bear departed, leaving Adams temporarily incapacitated and Ben completely confused. Adams and Ben made their way back to camp, and slowly the man regained his health and energy. The hole in his skull never healed fully and would routinely be opened up in the coming years. After healing a while, Adams constructed a huge cage, and his mind set on capturing a large grizzly. He hauled the trap into his hunting territory and set it up with bait and began watching. Once the trap was set, he had caught the largest grizzly bear ever caught in a live trap. This giant weighed 1,500 pounds when he was weighed on a hay scale, and John would call him Samson. Eventually, John would utilize his hunting and trapping skills to amass a small zoo's worth of animals. He started to show the public his animal collection and opened up a museum in San Francisco. It was during one of these shows in January of 1859 that Adams was wrestling with General Fremont when the bear struck him in the head, reopening the hole in his skull from the prior grizzly attack. Though it had been about 5 years since that attack, his scalp had partially healed but was displaced, and the hole in his skull remained open. After being struck this last time, Adams' brain tissue was exposed and his health began deteriorating. A few months later, in the summer of 1860, Adams was working with one of the monkeys in his menagerie when the monkey jumped onto his head and bit his unhealed wound where his brain was exposed. Experts believe the monkey bite may have led to meningitis, which is an infection of one of the layers of tissue surrounding the brain beneath the skull. After spending more than 10 years away from his wife and daughter, Adams retired back to Massachusetts but died a mere 5 days after the reunion. John Grizzly Adams left a legacy that would have him described as the greatest California mountain man of all time. He captured more grizzly bears than most mountain men of the time had killed. He was inducted into the Western Hall of Fame in 1911 and received the Heroes of California honor. Although not a trained scientist, Adams left behind the largest collection of mounted and live animal specimens in his museum, which eventually became the Pacific Museum in San Francisco. His menagerie spawned the Bronx Zoo and Zoological Gardens in Central Park, both of New York, as well as Woodward's Gardens and Fleshacre Zoo in the Bay Area. Adams' bear Samson actually served as the model for the California State Bear emblem. In addition, Adams narrated his memoirs to an author named Hittel, who compiled the book The Adventures of James Capen Adams. Later, his life story would be turned into a television series in the 1970s called The Life and Times of Grizzly Adams. I would love to hear your thoughts on this amazing story of Grizzly Adams and his bear friends, as well as his bear attack that eventually led to his death. I have to ask, did he prove that bears and humans can closely coexist safely? Were the actions of Adams harmful to bears? Please remember to like and subscribe, as well as to tap on that bell icon so you're notified on our next amazing bear attack story here on Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the Old West setting of the high canyons and mountains of Chihuahua, Mexico. There was a Spanish settlement there by the name of Colonia Pacheco. This area comprises 3 distinct geographic areas. An extinct volcano named Cerro Mojonoro is the highest mountain in the Sierra Madre Occidental Range, which makes up 1/3 of the area. The rest is plains and desert. The animal life includes white-tailed deer, wolves, bears, and cougars, plus smaller animals like bats, foxes, and raccoons. The native plant life include lechuguilla, mesquite, guayayol, and osotillo. The elevation averages around a mile high, which is the same as Denver, Colorado, back in the States. At the time, the state of Chihuahua had 18,279 people and 94,000 square miles, meaning there was only 5 people per square mile. That leaves plenty of room for big predators to roam, like brown bears. George and Hiram Nagel were brothers, and in the early summer of 1892, they were helping out on one of their family's many ranches. They were Mormon settlers pushed into Mexico after they were chased out of Missouri in the United States. The ranchers had been experiencing a rash of calf and colt predations, and the area was loaded with plenty of culprits. They had estimated a $300 loss so far this spring, and in those days, that amounted to several $1,000s in today money. On the Saturday before the day in question, Hiram had been out hunting down predators by himself. He came home and told George and the others that he had run into a really big brown bear, also called a grizzly bear. The 2 brothers decided they would go get that bear on Monday. They headed out to the area on Monday to where the bear was spotted and split up to search for him. They would regularly meet back up and discuss the plentiful sign and tracks in the area. They also found several carcasses of their calves consumed by the bear, with track evidence present. By Wednesday, June 22nd, 1892, they decided to hunt along the Gavilan River and pull all their cattle from the area to ensure their safety. The brothers split up for a while and found some of their herd and headed them down a small canyon. As they came out onto the side of the hill, Hiram spotted the big brown bear again. He yelled out, "Hey, there it is over there on that point." The brothers dismounted their horses and grabbed their rifles. Hiram shot a .44 Winchester lever-action rifle, and George shot a .45 Marlin. Hiram opened up the shooting and hit the bear in the vitals, followed by a good shot by George. The brothers continued to fire several more shots and were certain they were hitting the bear, but it continued to walk along the bottom of the canyon. The bear headed up the other side of the canyon, and George sent one more bullet in his direction. That bullet hit pay dirt and sent the massive bear tumbling back toward the bottom of the canyon, bawling the entire way. George worked the action of his rifle and managed to jam one bullet into the backside of another one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his pocket knife and began unjamming his rifle. The bear lay motionless on the ground for a few moments, but quickly struggled to his feet and crawled back up the hill about 30 yards to an oak tree, where he collapsed again. Hiram hollered out, "That got him! Let's leave our horses and take him on foot," and immediately began to pursue the bear. George had fired all 3 of his cartridges, was still working on clearing his last jammed cartridge, so he lagged behind by a few minutes. George yelled at Hiram not to follow so close to the bear trail, as the men were now equally placed on opposite sides of the canyon. George yelled at Hiram to approach the bear from directly below him. As George continued to fix his rifle, he could hear 3 quick rounds fired off by Hiram. George figured they were a signal of Hiram's arrival to the top of the hill, but when he looked up, he couldn't find his brother. He jumped up on his mule and quickly rode toward his brother's last known location. He got to the top of the hill and yelled for Hiram, but heard nothing in response. George began following the trail of the bear and his brother around a low rise. As he crested the rise, George could see the bear a short distance away, and it had something in its mouth. The bear was growling as he chewed on the bloody thing in its mouth. Then George saw Hiram's blue overalls underneath the bear. He could see the bear chewing and munching on Hiram's right hand very clearly. Upon seeing George, the bear spit out Hiram's hand and began heading up the hill again. George jumped off of his mule and began aiming his rifle at the bear. He fired one of his 3 remaining bullets and dropped the bear again, but the bear stood back up and started to head toward George now. He tripped to the ground, and so did the bear. The bear then clamped its jaws onto a thick pine limb and crushed it into splinters and began to climb the hill again with it in his mouth. George fired one more bullet of his 2 remaining. That bullet dropped the bear. It writhed in pain and anger, but was injured to the point it couldn't walk anymore. George quickly approached to within just a few yards and put the giant bear out of its misery, and Hiram's misery, with a bullet through the skull. Hiram had rolled over and rose to his hands and knees. He was horribly mangled, and his head was completely bloody and misshapen. George now confronted the reality of their predicament. They were 15 miles from their home and had no other people for help. He cried and prayed as he watched Hiram, now on his elbows, pour blood onto the ground from wounds on his head, shoulders, and face. The pool of blood beneath him grew visibly by the second. Hiram begged for water, and George ran down to the creek and brought back a hat full of water for him. He used part of the water to wash Hiram's wounds. George then began assessing his brother's injuries. Hiram's scalp was peeled back about 4 inches, starting at his forehead. At first, George only noticed the peeled scalp and several large punctures from the bear's teeth. After some examination, George could see where the bear had bitten from the back of his brother's head toward the right eye and crushed that portion of the skull in between. That part of his skull was pulled back, and fluid from his brother's brain leaked out. Hiram's cheek was gashed from just below his eye to just under his jawbone, and half of his lip was bitten off. On his face, head, and shoulders were 27 injuries. His right hand was horribly chewed, and his left hand was bitten through. There was a large bite wound just above Hiram's left knee and a bare paw imprint on his chest from a paw strike. George encouraged Hiram to muster all the faith he could, as only God could help him now. As his brother helped him, Hiram described what led to his horrible condition. Hiram explained the bear went over a rise just out of sight and laid down so he couldn't see it. He approached within a few yards before he noticed it, and the bear ambushed him. He pulled the trigger of his rifle, but it was a misfire. He continued to point his gun at the bear, hoping the powder would kick off as he ran backward. The bear initially struck him with his left paw, as his right shoulder was wounded by one of the prior shots. This slap broke Hiram's jaw and knocked him flat to the ground. The bear then clasped his head in its jaws. He raised his hands to protect himself, but the bear completely overwhelmed any attempt at defense he could make. After taking care of his brother for a moment, George looked around and located what must have been the initial attack scene a few yards away. Hiram's hat and gun were found there. George looked over Hiram's rifle and noticed that it was cocked and had all 3 cartridges in it still. His brother had only thought he was shooting at the bear during its charge and had never actually fired at it. He apparently didn't chamber a round and mistakenly simply pulled the trigger without a round in it and thought it had misfired. The young cowboy was tough and rode the 1.5 miles back to camp on his horse. George made a bed for him and gave him some milk and water to help revive him a bit. He bandaged his brother's wounds with cloths soaked in salt water and continued to clean up his wounds. Hiram fainted a few times from the trauma, blood loss, and pain, but began to recover a bit. He begged his brother not to leave him alone, even if it was to go get help. Either option for the boys was not great. Hiram was in no condition to ride the rough 15-mile trail back home, and leaving him alone to travel that same trail, going and back, might leave him without help in his last moments. Hiram said that he thought he could make the ride home, with the help of God, and his brother would get everything ready at once. George gathered 2 gallons of water and put his slicker on Hiram as the weather had begun to look like rain. The boys prayed together before George helped Hiram into the saddle, supporting him with rolled-up blankets. Hiram actually made the entire trip alive, while leading his own horse the whole way with only his left hand. He required several sips of water and rode through the night to get home by 10 p.m. Together they crossed timber and canyons in their trip, but they made it home. George gathered up the church leaders and family from the Pacheco area, and they took turns changing his bandages and praying for him and with him. They sent for a doctor from a neighboring town. They used every form of treatment to stop the swelling, infection, and bleeding, but eventually could do no more. Hiram fought hard to keep his life, but suddenly opened his left eye wide and looked around the room at its occupants as if to say goodbye, then breathed a few short breaths and died. George marveled to the others present how Hiram didn't complain or groan during or after the attack, and somehow made the 15-mile ride home. He was extraordinarily tough. His 19-year-old widow of only 6 months wept loudly as her 23-year-old husband slipped away from her while in her arms. Hiram passed away on June 24, 1892, 2 days after the grizzly bear attack, most likely from infection. After understanding all the details of this case, I'm left wondering, did the bear lay up in ambush waiting for Hiram? Did the young men actually hit the bear as many times as they thought? Was the bear so tough that it actually lived through 8 or so rifle shots hitting it? What do you think was Hiram's most costly mistake? Post your comments below and let's talk about it. Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to the untamed frontier of central Idaho. The headwaters of the Middle Fork of the Salmon River is sparsely populated by people even now. The steep, decomposed granite mountains are covered with pine and fir trees and low-growing berry bushes like blueberry, huckleberry, elderberry, and raspberry. These berry bushes provide seasonal nutrients, sugars, and minerals to animals ranging from chipmunks to grizzly bears. Mountain bluebirds stand out as they flit through the green scrub bush that screen the privacy of the deer and the elk that roam the valleys. This area is extremely rugged and very isolated, but in June of 1886, it was the kind of country that beckoned to tough frontier people. Old Ike was one of the most successful bear hunters in the Rocky Mountains and called central Idaho his home. With ranches and farms springing up across the newly formed state, the demand for a bear hunter was at an all-time high. Many of the ranchers and farmers in Idaho had to raise their food and hope for enough to sell to others. Bears didn't bother following the customs of human society and would simply kill and eat whatever livestock they would need to survive. That's when Old Ike came into the picture. He would study the bear and its patterns and carefully set up a confrontation he knew he would win. He would get a nice grizzly rug or hide and some meat and some very useful bear tallow out of the deal, and they would also pay him for his services. There were safer jobs a man could do, but most of these jobs are taken by men who aren't brave enough to be a bear bounty hunter. Old Ike was a hunting legend as he single-handedly killed around 100 grizzly bears, bringing safety to livestock herds and prosperity to ranches and farms throughout Idaho. He's been contacted about a huge grizzly up on the untamed Salmon River headwaters that is terrorizing local ranches. Old Ike and a few young partners head toward the area and in a few days are speaking with the ranch owners about the problem bears in the area. Most ranchers feel like they can handle the black bears of the area, but this giant grizzly bear that calls the area around Dagger Falls his home is far too fierce for them to handle. Old Ike agrees with his partners to head out and find the giant grizz and bring a little frontier justice to him. As Old Ike and his group arrive in the area, they survey the lay of the land. Being familiar with grizzly bears, Old Ike knows that the bears will use certain resources at certain times and other resources at other times. And this early in the summer, the bears will be hunting deer fawns and elk calves along the mountain meadows. Predators including wolves, cougars, and bears use the transition and cover between forests and meadows to sneak upon their prey. Ike knows this and begins searching meadow edges for bear tracks and scat. The hunters are about 2 weeks into their stalk when they come across some huge and very promising tracks along a small creek. They are definitely grizzly bear tracks, and big enough to be the tracks of the dominant bear in the area. Old Ike is certain it is the bear he's looking for. The hunters set up a few baits and traps to see if they can lure the big bear into the open, and it isn't long before they are seeing some interesting progress. They find the bear's tracks leaving a marsh and follow him for several miles. At the far end of the meadow, they see the big bear striding across the edge of the trees. The men hustle to a point at which they can intercept the bear, and their hard work pays off with a good shot. Old Ike follows his instincts and is rewarded with a good solid hit on the giant bruin. When shooting a large bear, the hunter will ideally strike a bone of some sort. The most damaging shots will break the bones of the shoulder, legs, or hips. This will keep the bear from going too far too fast and will hopefully keep it from killing you. Old Ike's shot passed through the ribs and created a nice blood trail, but definitely didn't break anything structural, like a bone. The men trailed the bear until its blood trail led into a patch of very thick, small trees. This type of tree patch is called the jack pine patch, and consists of shorter pine trees typically under about 8 feet in height. The branches grow wide and low and create an environment that is easy to move through, but very difficult to see even medium distances in. Old Ike knows how bears and other animals use jack pine stands to conceal themselves or their escape routes, so he slowly follows each drop of blood into the stand, moving from drop to drop and splatter to splatter. The old man is not what he used to be in his youth, as his vision and hearing are losing their sharpness. He can see the larger blood spatters easily, but misses some of the smaller drops. His hearing still picks up the lower loud tones, like a growl, but doesn't quite get the higher pitched sounds anymore, like small twigs snapping just a few yards to his right. Unbeknownst to Old Ike, the wily grizzly bear has set up a trap to catch his hunter. Being a predator himself, the bear knows if he walks in a straight line and circles back to within just a few yards of his old trail, his hunter will walk right in front of him without knowing how close the bear is, and that is exactly what the giant bear does. As Old Ike follows the blood sign and tracks further into the jack pine stand, he incrementally follows a path that leads him right in front of the concealed bear. Just as Old Ike walks past the bear, the giant Bruin leaps from its hiding spot and shoves the hunter to the ground. This bear is so large that the frail and gaunt old man is no match for him and thumps on the ground. The enraged and wounded grizzly next opens up its enormous mouth and bites into Old Ike's chest. The enraged and wounded grizzly next opens its enormous mouth and bites into Old Ike's chest. As the bear closes its jaws, his canine teeth puncture the skin and penetrate Old Ike's ribcage. Then the bear crushes the old man's chest with a single bite. Old Ike's hunting partners can hear the yelling and growling coming from the jack pine patch and rush in to see what's going on. As they approach, they can see the bear standing over Old Ike and run the bear off so they can help their friend. Shooting at the bear as it stood over Ike could have wounded or killed their friend, and the bear fled the attack scene quickly anyway. Old Ike is in bad shape, and he's struggling to breathe. His face is wrinkled in pain, and his color is fading as he's losing the battle for his life. In only a few minutes, his breath shortens, and he dies from the injuries imparted by the grizzly bear. Old Ike's legacy as a bear bounty hunter is cemented into Idaho history. With his passing, and many farmers and ranchers say he brought stability and safety to the frontier. But today there are some who say he decimated a species he may have misunderstood. What do you think? Do you think Old Ike performed a necessary service to the area farms and ranches? Or do you think he did more damage than he helped?
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us back to the Old West, but specifically to the border of Oregon and California. This area is still pretty wild, but back in the mid-1800s it was only populated by brave souls who understood the risk to their lives in the forests surrounding them. In those days, the steep and foreboding granite peaks were covered with pine, fir, and spruce trees, and packed with deadly animals like cougars, wolves, black bears, as well as brown bears. Sure, there were lots of deer, elk, and maybe even moose, but you risk your life hunting them while surrounded by this murderer's row of apex predators. In the 1860s, the West still had plenty of grizzlies, and they presented a dangerous menace to anyone who managed to cross them, which was apparently easy to do. In the year 1869, in the Oregon wilds of Jackson and Klamath counties, a giant grizzly made the canyonlands of the Siskiyou Mountains his hunting grounds. When a rancher would investigate any of the many cattle this giant bear would kill, enormous tracks would lead away from the partially eaten carcass, creating a sense of fear. There were many grizzlies in this area, and even several who would kill and eat livestock, but none had the tracks of this bruiser. In the most remote expanses of the forest in this area, giant wild grizzlies could still be found, but not all of them were intelligent, crafty, and easily identifiable like this one. At Fall Creek, woodsman and rancher Bruce Grieve had set a bear trap in an attempt to capture and kill one of the many bears, killing his livestock. At one point, Grieve's bear trap had caught the forefoot of a huge bear, and in tearing itself loose, it had severed 3 of its claws. As an adaptation to the missing toes and claws, the bear turned its paw outward, toward the side as it walked, giving it a clear and discernible track each time it struck area livestock. In time, the less cautious grizzlies were thinned out, but the wise, crafty, and deliberating grizzlies like Old Reelfoot would persist. Despite his injured front foot, Old Reelfoot was renowned to kill a steer as quickly as most bears would kill a calf. He even had a distinct way of hunting and killing the livestock he pursued. He was known to survey cattle from an elevated position. Using his power and speed, Old Reelfoot would catch up to any cattle that caught his eye and plow into them with all of his weight, knocking them to the ground. He would clamp his powerful jaws under the spine just behind the shoulders of the cattle and crush the bones, crippling the animal immediately. Carcasses of bulls, cows, and steers would often be found with his telltale killing methods surrounded by his massive and unique tracks. Now, ranchers were not about to take these losses lying down. They'd purchased and set out steel-jawed traps all over their ranches, hoping to curb the predation of their livestock. But these efforts all ended in failure, as the giant old bear would slip away to resume his cattle hunting in greener pastures. Even paid professional hunters couldn't catch up with Old Reelfoot, at least not enough to put an end to him. Just like Old Ephraim, Old Reelfoot would kill livestock and eat his fill. Most bears would stick around and defend the carcass in order to consume as much of it as they could, but not this bear. He would be gone onto the next cow or bull by morning time. It almost seemed like he enjoyed the killing as much as he enjoyed the eating. As Old Reelfoot was pursued, he would use the cover of the forest to put distance between himself and hunters, so much so that horse-mounted hunters couldn't keep up. Not only his remarkable tracks gave his location away, but a long trail of dead livestock were left in his wake as well. Ranchers got together and piled up a nice bounty of $2,700 for his hide. Now that doesn't make me want to grab my rifle and go after a giant grizzly that no one else can catch or kill, but back in those days it was a lot of money. Motivated hunters ventured into the forest, and some even found Old Reelfoot's tracks, but none reported seeing the elusive bear. It seemed like he knew what the hunters would do before they did. Then he would escape from their sights at just the right moment. In the spring of 1882, a rancher by the name of J.D. Williams was herding his sheep near Bald Mountain around Ashland, Oregon. In the valley below his herd of sheep, Williams could see several cattle grazing. He knew the cattle belonged to another rancher by the name of David Horn. Williams noticed a giant bear burst out of the tree line, and he scrambled to climb the nearest tree. From this vantage point, Williams watched as Old Reelfoot rushed in and killed a calf. The cow tried to protect her calf, but the bear killed her stone dead with a single swat from its paw. The herd bull charged Old Reelfoot and bowled him over. Growling as he rose, the massive bear charged after the bull in a prolonged pursuit. Once the bear caught the bull, he crushed its spine with a powerful bite and returned to finish eating the calf. After eating his fill, Old Reelfoot was observed wallowing in a nearby mud hole and then wandered off. George Cook was a local hunter who pursued Old Reelfoot, as the bounty offered by the stockmen would make it worth the effort. He stalked the mountains for weeks with his .38-55 hunting rifle, and his efforts eventually paid off, kind of. He managed to get within range of the bear and fired a single shot before the bear disappeared. Cook followed a diminishing blood trail before giving up the pursuit, knowing he had merely wounded the giant bear. One of the stockmen by the name of William Wright decided the best way to get rid of Old Reelfoot was to rig up a trap gun. Now, if you don't know what a trap gun is, listen up. It's a hunting rifle or shotgun bound to a tree or staked to the ground. Then a tripwire is set so that when an animal, or a person, pulls the tripwire tied, it fires. The downside of such a rig is that any animal that comes along could trip the gun. But using the proper bait, say, like a cow carcass, it just might lead to success in ending Old Reelfoot's cattle wrestling days. Wright set up his trap gun in such a way that the only way the gun would fire was if the bear was right next to the cow carcass he was using as bait. He was more than sure of his setup and thought for sure that if this bear showed up, he would be dead. A few days after setting the trap gun over the bait, Wright decided to check on the rig. To his dismay, the carcass had been dragged away, and the entire trap gun rig was completely untouched. The bear had crept in and pulled the cow carcass from right in front of the trap gun without getting shot. The only way this could have been done was for the bear to understand the purpose and design of the rig, according to Wright. As Wright examined the scene, he could see Old Reelfoot's tracks circle the bait, then approach from the downhill side of the carcass and direction the trap gun was aimed. He then leaned on a tree with one paw while reaching out with his other to pull the carcass from in front of the trap gun. Wright tried several more times to kill Old Reelfoot, but eventually took a break, because being outsmarted by a grizzly bear weighs on a man's self-esteem. Over time, Wright thought of when he first encountered Old Reelfoot. He recalled how he saw that big old grizzly bear rush from the edge of the trees near his pasture toward his prized bull. The bull only had time to lift its head and snort before Old Reelfoot was on him. With one mighty swipe of the bear's paws, that big bull went down, deader than a doornail. Just to make sure, Old Reelfoot crushed the bull's spine in his signature move to keep his prey from getting away. Wright flashed back to how he immediately dashed for his rifle, pulling it from the buckhorn gun rack in his living room. He worked a shell into the rifle's chamber and put a few more in his pocket before slipping back out of the cabin. As he approached his pasture, Wright took a wide arcing path that brought him to within 100 yards of his now dead bull. He couldn't see the bear, so he crept in closer to within 25 yards. Wright remembered cocking his head to listen for any noise, a twig cracking, a small rock tumbling down an embankment, but heard nothing. The bear had given him the slip, and he searched for soft ground to examine for tracks. Sure enough, he found the tracks of Old Reelfoot. These memories ate at Wright until they grew into motivation. He knew either him or that bear must go. Wright devised a clever plan to kill Old Reelfoot and recruited a neighbor boy of only 17 years of age, Pearl Bean, to help him. The boy was a natural in the woods and could track a beaver across a pond. Another local rancher, Pedro Smith, along with 2 others, joined the hunting party. The hunting party headed out on April 4th. Pearl packed his .44-40 Winchester hunting rifle and a 9-inch long hunting blade with him. Wright carried his .56-52 rimfire Spencer rifle and lots of venison jerky and ammo. It wasn't too long into the hunt before the 5-man hunting party decided to split up to cover more ground. Wright and Bean decided they would go one way, and the other 3 hunters headed off in another direction. After Bean and Wright found Old Reelfoot's fresh tracks, they returned to camp to tell the other hunters. The men followed the tracks for several miles and spotted the giant bear a few miles away across the canyon. One of the hunters released his hounds, despite the others objecting. The hunters pursued the bear for several hours, but returned to camp dejected and exhausted. They decided to return home and come up with a new plan to kill the wily old bear. On their way home, Wright and Bean decided to try to find the bear again the next day without the other hunters and their hounds. The 2-man hunting party mounted their horses on April 5th and set out following Old Reelfoot's tracks. They pitched camp for the night and slept by the coals of their fire beneath the stars. As soon as the sun rose, the men were back in the saddle trying to catch up on Old Reelfoot, whom they believed probably traveled through the night. At times there was abundant sign the bear had been in the area. They would find logs torn open by the bear as it searched for insects. At other times they would have to spend valuable time scouring the ground for any sign at all that the big bear had traveled through. Soon enough, they figured out the big bear knew they were following him. They may have been close enough that he caught their scent on a breeze. Either way, his tracks made a beeline for the roughest and highest country the Siskiyou Mountains offered. Old Reelfoot led the men through tangled brush and through steep canyons until they followed him into the snow-capped peaks of the range. On April 10, 1890, William Wright and Pearl Bean led their horses into a clearing, and there stood Old Reelfoot, just 80 yards away. The giant bear instantly knew he was in a fight for his life. He stood to his hind legs and stretched out his paws toward the men, in a way venting his rage at their pursuit. The bear rocked forward and onto all fours before speeding toward the men, who immediately dismounted their horses. They could see the rage in the bear's eyes, glowing like embers in a fire, and watched as the steaming air puffed from his lungs into clouds alongside the bear. Wright pulled his rifle stock to his cheek and aimed at Old Reelfoot's throat before squeezing the trigger, and immediately working his action to reload. Bean had dropped to one knee and was firing his rifle as quickly as he could work the action, driving .44 caliber slugs into the bear's chest over and over. The bear's only reaction was more ferocity, as none of the slugs could slow its approach. As it streaked toward the men, Old Reelfoot bit branches and tossed them, and swiped at snow and sticks, sending debris flying in all directions. At a distance of just 30 yards from the men, Old Reelfoot stumbled and then collapsed. The blood and the snow all around him bore the truth of the path of each bullet the men had fired. But the giant bear wasn't done yet. He slowly regained his feet and sniffed the air, as if he were unsure of just where the men had went. Finally picking up their scent, Old Reelfoot again began to run toward Wright and Bean. Both men fired simultaneously at the back of the bear's throat in desperation to end its progress toward them. Just 20 feet from the men, Old Reelfoot suddenly piled up. Old Reelfoot was finally dead, and his days of killing livestock were ended. Bean's 9-inch hunting knife was used as a means to measure the size of the bear. Its body was 8 feet long, and its chest was 40 inches wide. Its claws estimated to be 4.5 inches in length, and its ears were 10.5 inches apart. The distance around the massive bear's muzzle was 42 inches from ear to ear, and they estimated it weighed 1,800 pounds. Now keep in mind, these were cattlemen, and estimating a big animal's weight was commonplace for them, so I tend to trust their estimate. As they skinned the bear, they counted 10 bullet holes at least in its hide, and noticed its teeth were worn short. They also found Cook's .38-55 rifle round, which had flattened itself upon impacting Old Reelfoot's shoulder bone. Once skinned, Old Reelfoot's hide was mounted and placed on a wagon for paying customers to see, for a small fee. Eventually, Old Reelfoot's stuffed exhibit was lost to time, but soldiers returning from World War I insisted they had seen the bear exhibited while in Europe. A museum in Wairika, California still displays one of Old Reelfoot's claws in remembrance of a bear that many ranchers feared. William Wright's nephew, George, still lives near the town of Hornbrook and still has his uncle's old 56-62 Spencer hunting rifle that killed Old Reelfoot. Well, that was an amazing story of a magnificent bear. After reviewing the details surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Do you think if Old Reelfoot didn't have all those cattle to eat, that he would have turned to eating people? Would Old Reelfoot have been killed by other hunters or ranchers if Wright and Bean hadn't pursued him on his own territory? Would you like to live in a remote ranch surrounded by hungry grizzly bears? I will enjoy reading and answering your thoughts, so please post them in the comment section below, and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is called The Man-Killing Grizzly Known as Two Toes, and takes place in the still very primitive location near Yellowstone National Park. The year was 1912, and it was a bright, warm day in May near Crevice Mountain in southwest Montana. A 63-year-old prospector by the name of Johnny Graham was crossing the creek when his favorite pack horse stumbled. She fell flat on her side and had a hard time regaining her feet. Johnny pulled at the reins and yelled at her, "Come on, come on," trying to encourage her to get out of the creek. Finally, she stumbled from the creek and onto the bank, but was in terrible shape. Johnny looked down at her crooked leg and knew she was done. He sorrowfully marched her a few yards off the trail and pulled out his hunting rifle. The single shot dispatched her mercifully, as the old gold miner knew she would never recover from such a horrendous injury. A few days later, Johnny was returning from his claim to his cabin, a short distance from where he dispatched his pack horse, when he noticed the largest grizzly bear he had ever seen. He figured this big bear was headed to the remains of his pack horse and watched cautiously to see if his suspicions were true. He peeked through the willows and watched a robust and very healthy boar approach the horse carcass and start eating. Being a man of the backwoods, Johnny knew he was too old to stock up on a bear of that size, so he devised a plan. The next day, just after noontime, Johnny knew the bear would be full of horse meat from the carcass, so he carefully crept in and placed a large 60-pound bear trap near the carcass and stealthily crept away. He figured he would give it a few days and see if anything turned up in it. Johnny decided to swing by one day and take a look at the trap, and to his amazement, it was gone. The trap was heavily constructed of thick steel and featured jagged teeth designed into the metal. The trap's absence meant it was either stolen or the bear tore it loose and walked away with it still attached. Johnny began looking around to read the sign in the area and found some large bear tracks leading away and showing obvious signs of an impaired gait. Johnny warily followed the tracks a little over 200 yards down the hill. Amongst the trees, he saw the giant bear as he struggled against the trap. It was wedged between two fallen trees. Johnny thought quietly to himself how fortunate he was to have such an opportunity at a giant bear like this. He leveled his rifle at the bear and took careful aim. Johnny placed 2 shots to the bear's ribs, and the massive bruin collapsed and ceased all movement. Johnny triumphantly walked up to the trophy. He leaned his rifle against a nearby tree and unsheathed his skinning knife. This bear's hide was going to make a very nice rug for his den, he thought. As he approached the motionless bear, the massive bruin sprang to life. In a frenetic burst of motion, it tore itself loose from the steel trap, severing 3 of its toes. Johnny didn't even have time to turn to run, as the bear ripped into him, biting, clawing, and chewing mercilessly, but leaving him alive. The bear's severed toes and 4-inch claws remained behind as Johnny's only trophy, as the bear fled the scene. A short while later, a passerby found the miner in terrible condition and ran to get help after hearing the details of the encounter. The local miners and lumberjacks gathered together with their firearms and headed out to locate the bear before it could do any more damage to anyone else. The hunting party, hell-bent on revenge and eliminating the massive bear, pursued him until he crossed a raging river and entered nearby Yellowstone Park and its safety from hunters. Disappointed, the men knew what they risked had they pursued the bear into the park, and they turned back to check on Johnny. He succumbed to his wounds shortly thereafter. In 1960, Pat Welsh was delivering supplies near Soda Butte Creek, near Yellowstone. One night while sleeping, the 61-year-old woodsman was awakened by the familiar sounds of a bear in camp, raiding his supplies of ham and bacon. Welsh grabbed some pots and pans and clanged them together, trying to scare the bear off, as this wasn't exactly a rare event for the area. The bear was not at all frightened of the clatter, and actually advanced toward the man menacingly. Pat grabbed for the nearest weapon, an axe used for cutting firewood, and started swinging it to back the bear down. The giant grizzly easily swatted the axe from his hands, rendering the men defenseless, and proceeded to tear, bite, and claw Pat from head to toe. Pat's companion grabbed some Roman candles they had and chased the bear off. He tried to take care of Pat, but he succumbed to his wounds within a few days. His friend noted that after the attack scene was checked out in the daylight, the bear was missing 3 toes on his front foot. On the 12th of June 1922, a backwoods outlaw known as Frenchie was setting traps along Slow Creek, right outside of Yellowstone Park. His real name was Joseph Duray, and he didn't really respect the law against hunting and trapping in the park, and pretty much did whatever he pleased. While checking his trap line one day, Frenchie noticed he had managed to catch a giant bear in one of his traps. He ran home to gather his hunting rifle and told his wife he'll be back by nightfall. He hurried back to the area but was caught off guard by the giant Bruin, who attacked the man and mauled him severely. Frenchie's rifle was found near the trap, and it could only be surmised that he was approaching the bear for a kill shot behind the bear's ear, but somehow he missed and the bear got a hold of him. The rifle's barrel had damage from the bear's teeth, and the stock had been torn in two by the angry Bruin. In the bear's hasty retreat from the scene of Frenchie's mauling, he departed with the trap still clinging to his leg and dragging the chain in the dirt behind. The trap was found about a year later, minus the bear it once clinged to. Old Two Toes was never heard from again.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode is a throwback to a prior time when grizzlies and humans existed and competed on much more even footing, if there could be such a thing with a massive and powerful animal. In the Old West, grizzlies terrorized remote ranches with relative impunity, and southeast Idaho was no exception. This episode takes place near a small town called Soda Springs, just north of the Idaho-Utah border, but extends and concludes into North Utah, near what is today Logan County and the thriving city of Logan, Utah. This area used to be filled to the brim with big old grizzly bears, and may still have a few. The Cache National Forest of today is a sprawling and primitive forest system which at the time sheltered a grizzly of great cunning, appetite, and power. The steep mountains here are packed with stands of pine, fir, and spruce trees, interrupted by quaking aspen wherever there is water. Along creeks, streams, and ponds you will find willows and other dense bushes acting as screens for wildlife including mule deer, elk, and moose. The predators of this area include coyotes, cougars, black bears, but no longer include big old grizzly bears. On August 22, 1923, a grizzly hunter by the name of Frank Clark was following a very unique set of bear tracks. He had been stalking a bear known as Old Ephraim for several years, for 9 years to be precise. Frank was born in Cherry Creek, Idaho, which is still on the state map today, surprisingly. Most small towns from back then have disappeared, but not Cherry Creek. Clark was part owner of the Ward Clark Sheep Company, and the company had been experiencing a damaging influence on its bottom line. It seemed there was a cunning and hungry grizzly bear taking down the sheep numbers of the company as they grazed the mountains. Now, sheep aren't the brightest of animals, which is probably what makes them such good farm animals and bear food. We all know the valuable and useful wool they yield each year, which can be made into warm socks, gloves, hats, and other garments, but they can also be a source of meat to humans and bears alike. Over the last several years, Old Ephraim had taken down and eaten untold numbers of domestic sheep from the area, and sheep farmers were at their wits' end in dealing with him. He would outsmart every attempt at catching or killing him by sniffing out human scent on any traps left in his many wallows. Whenever he found a trap, he would carefully pull the trap from the mud and fling it aside, allowing him to cool off in the muddy water. He was also a master of disappearing. Each time he would strike, his incursions would be marked with partially eaten sheep and his unique three-toed tracks, but hunters wouldn't find hide nor hair of the massive bear. Each time they followed his tracks, he would disappear into the vast wilderness area along the state border, just to resurface somewhere else and wreak havoc on sheep herds there. Legend has it that at one of his raids, Old Ephraim went around swatting and biting sheep in a bloodthirsty rampage that killed 50 sheep in a single night. As you can imagine, this took a toll on the sheep farmers, and getting rid of Old Ephraim was a main topic of conversation whenever they got together. Back in those days, local police and sheriff's deputies were trying to catch outlaws, and were too busy to focus on killing a grizzly. That dangerous work was left up to ranchers and farmers themselves. Clark had worked on developing and understanding Old Ephraim's pattern of hunting and killing sheep. Typically, the giant bear would sneak into a sheep herd and kill a single sheep, then carry it off into the brush, a great distance to consume it alone. At first, this behavior was a nuisance more than anything. Taking a single sheep from a herd might go unnoticed for a while by a sheepherder, but add it all up over a summer, and that herd might be down several head by the end. Old Ephraim was cunning, in that he wouldn't return to the same sheep herd that he had hit any time recently. He would wander many miles to find his next meal from another herd, and disappear before his antics could get him killed. This elusive and calculating behavior was a statement on how well he understood the behavior of sheepherders. Somehow the big old bear knew that if he spent too much time in one place, he would be on the receiving end of some very fast lead projectiles aimed at bringing his herd-raiding antics to an end, so he continually moved from herd to herd. On July 13, 1911, Clark had moved his operation into the wilderness area along the state border and immediately began to lose sheep to Old Ephraim. In fact, in a single grazing season, the old bear took his herds down 154 sheep. Shepherds knew it was him by his three-toed track, which was apparently a birth defect and not due to an injury from a trap, so common back then. The first thing Clark noticed about Old Ephraim's raid on the shepherds was that he would eat nearly all of the sheep carcass, unlike other bears in the area. He wasn't wasteful or a wanton killer, but apparently very hungry and couldn't find easier game than the numerous and easy-to-capture sheep. Clark recalled a particularly impressive run-in with Old Ephraim in his memoirs. He stated that the giant bear was making off with an entire sheep when the shepherd caught him in the act. Clark fired his .25-35 rifle several times at the bear, but apparently missed him with each shot, which he blamed on the fact that the bear was headed straight up a steep hill with the sheep. Clark decided then that this bear must be stopped and immediately began placing steel-jawed traps in bear wallows he found in Old Ephraim's territory. Time after time, the traps would be sprung with no sign of the bear. On other occasions, Clark would find the traps painstakingly dragged from the wallow and set aside, so that Old Ephraim was afforded a refreshing mud bath in peace. Clark came to realize that Old Ephraim wasn't your typical grizzly, but was very intelligent, deliberate, and careful. These traits would make him very hard to trap and kill, as the shepherd would find out over the course of several years. While pursuing Old Ephraim, Clark would recall killing over 50 bears, but none of them had the distinctive tracks of the old giant bear. Bear wallows were scattered about the area, and Old Ephraim would travel his territory and take mud baths in whichever wallow was convenient. Each time Clark would think he had the bear, but his effort would come up fruitless, and he would head back to the drawing board for his next effort. On August 21, 1923, Clark had noticed that Old Ephraim had returned to a wallow very familiar to him. The bear had dug out the wallow to suit his enormous size and had enjoyed bathing in the mud a few days prior to Clark finding it. Clark developed a new strategy to employ his bear traps and set the wallow up, hoping one last time that Old Ephraim would miss some detail that would lead to his capture and death. Clark pitched his camp about 1 mile uphill from the wallow and waited. He figured he could check the trap at the wallow each day until the bear was caught or had moved on. On the night in question, the peace of the early morning was shattered by a deafening roar from the direction of the trap-encircled bear wallow. Frank knew by the roar, which was followed by a long, sorrowful moan, that a bear had found the business end of one of his bear traps. But was it Old Ephraim? Now Clark knew that if the bear was caught in the trap, it would be there in the morning, so he closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't return. He knew he had to answer that nagging question in his mind, so he grabbed his .25-35 rifle and the ball ammunition it fired, and set out toward the trap without even putting on his trousers. As Clark navigated the trail toward the wallow in the dark, he heard a chain rattle behind him. When he was setting the trap, he had anchored it to a large log with a 14-foot chain to make sure any bear caught in it wouldn't go far, but the giant bear had already made his way in part toward Clark's tent and was now in the creek, between the man and his camp. Clark listened in the dark, waiting for more clues as to the precise location of the bear. His teeth rattled just as much as the chain each time the bear moved. Clark's dog Ginny hadn't alerted him to the bear, as she was too afraid of a confrontation with it. Clark could hear the bear thrashing the log and chain around in the creek, but knew it was far too dark to approach him. He made his way up the hill a ways and listened to the bear roar and groan until daylight. As soon as dawn broke, Clark knew he had a huge advantage on the bear, which any hunter would need. Clark searched the thick willow stands for the bear, but couldn't find Old Ephraim's location. The bear had laid up along the creek bank for a nap after a night of roaring and dragging the log around had exhausted him. Clark knew he didn't want to be surprised by the bear, so he picked up sticks and tossed them into any thick willows or deadwood he could come upon. At one point, a stick apparently landed near the giant bear and flushed him upstream, very near Clark's tent. Old Ephraim crawled into some tightly packed willows just a few yards from Clark's camp and wouldn't be flushed from it again. Clark searched the willow patch and could see a patch of the bear's fur, and figured if it was the only shot he had, he would take it. He fired his rifle and grazed Old Ephraim's shoulder. The wound made the giant bear stand to his feet with his back to Clark. Clark could see the 14-foot-long chain that held the trap to the log completely wrapped around the bear's right front paw. Together with a 23-pound trap, the bear was holding up close to 100 pounds over his head, as if it were nothing. Then he turned around to face the man, with only a few yards separating them. Clark knew that old Ephraim could have bolted, even with the heavy chain and log and trap firmly affixed to his paw. As the bear glared at him, Clark was filled with terror, so much so that he couldn't raise his rifle. He would later state that the bear was the most magnificent sight any man could see. Instead of trying to dash toward Clark, the 9-foot, 11-inch tall grizzly walked on his hind legs toward him, waving the heavy trap around above his head. The man knew that the bear wouldn't be able to step over a pile of deadfall between them, but Clark was still paralyzed with fear. The experienced woodsman had never had such an intense confrontation with a bear the size of old Ephraim. He couldn't move or react until the bear approached to within 6 feet of him. Clark pushed his rifle forward toward the bear and pulled the trigger without aiming. Old Ephraim fell backward and onto his rear, stunned for a few seconds. The .25-35 rifle Clark was using to try to dispatch old Ephraim was far too small to kill a bear of this size effectively. The giant bear quickly regained his feet and began to walk toward Clark once again. His rifle held a total of 7 rounds, and Clark quickly went through 5 of the 6 remaining cartridges, while the bear staggered toward him. Just as old Ephraim crossed the trail that separated him from Clark, the man decided to hit the trail himself. He began to run downhill and figured he wouldn't stop until he reached Logan, 20 miles away. Clark turned to look, and old Ephraim was still on his hind legs following him. This time Jenny had found her courage and was nipping at his heels as he pursued Clark. After a short but slow pursuit, Clark found enough courage to turn and face old Ephraim. He approached the bear, who was still walking on his hind legs toward him. Clark could see blood squirting from the bear's massive nose each time it breathed. He knew old Ephraim was injured severely and thought maybe he would avoid a severe mauling after all. Clark raised his rifle one last time and aimed for the softened spot underneath its jaw. There are no bones there until the base of the skull, and this bullet hit pay dirt. The giant bear piled up, dead, after several shots from the underpowered rifle fired by the shepherd. Clark was immediately filled with regret at terminating the beautiful giant bear. He felt a sudden longing for human company, but was utterly alone, as the horses had been scared away during the hunt. Eventually, Clark found one of his horses tangled up in a nearby wash. He hopped onto its back and rode 3 miles to a nearby herder's camp. He rested there and replenished his fortitude before returning to where he'd left old Ephraim. The shepherd returned with Clark to examine the bear and help in skinning it. The men dug a hole and buried old Ephraim's remains, only taking his hide as a keepsake. Once the death of the legend got out, a group of Boy Scouts from Troop 43 planned and executed a trip to exhume old Ephraim's bones, or at least his skull. They commented that it was very stinky and packed it out stuck on the end of a long pole to maintain safe smelling distance from the skull. They submitted the bear's enormous skull to the Smithsonian Institute, which eventually returned it to Utah State University. It is still displayed at the Merrill Library. Clark recalled that old Ephraim had bit a 6-inch thick aspen log in 2 pieces with a single bite on one occasion. In another example of his biting power, he had bit a 13-foot-long pine log, 12 inches in diameter, into 11 pieces. The wood looked as if it had been chopped into firewood. Today, old Ephraim's memory lives on. The winner of the Bear 100-mile endurance race is awarded the Old Ephraim Award for Toughness. A life-size bronze statue stands along U.S. Route 89 near Montpelier, Idaho. In 2014, it was updated with a statue including the bear trap, which is a key part of the legend. During Operation Iraqi Freedom, B Company, 16th Battalion's 3rd Signal Brigade created and awarded the Old Ephraim Award annually to the soldier best exemplifying his fighting spirit. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Prior to this episode, had you heard of the legend of Old Ephraim? Would you like to be a shepherd back near the turn of the last century? Why do you think it took so many shots to take old Ephraim down? Are you going to try to bite a 6-inch thick aspen branch in 2 to see if you can bite through it? If you do, make sure to take a picture and send it to me. As always, I will enjoy reading and replying to your thoughts, so please post them below and let's talk about it.
Welcome back to Scary Bear Attacks. Today's episode takes us to a remote location and almost 150 years back in time. In northern Utah, the Wasatch Range was just as foreboding and rugged as it is today. Mount Nebo is the tallest peak in the range, rising an impressive 11,928 feet in elevation, and features steep hillsides, sudden cliffs, and hidden canyons.
The forests here consist of pine, fir, and aspen groves, with wild berry bushes flowering and fruiting throughout the summer and early fall. Common animals here include elk, deer, bighorn sheep, and moose. The predators here include coyotes, cougars, bobcats, and black bears. The missing element in the predators here is grizzly bears, but in the 1870s grizzlies prowled the forests, presenting danger to visitors and getting by on their wits as much as their claws. On December 3, 1878, 23-year-old Abraham Powell adventured out on a deer hunting expedition with Abe's brother John Powell and Little John Powell, Jr. Also accompanying the Powell clan were mutual friends, Caleb Rhodes and Robert Snyder. They began their hunting trip on November 23rd and left their families in the comfortable confines of the homesteads and the warmth of the cabins there. They arrived at their destination near Nebo Creek a few days later. Now these fellows were not strangers to grizzly bears. They knew the key to hunting apex predators like grizzlies was to see them before they saw you. On one of his hunting trips, John had seen a big old grizzly bear on a ridge and climbed a parallel ridge to get a shot at it. He fired and missed once, but his second shot stunned the bear, which allowed John to claim its pelt and meat and establish a little more safety in the mountains. He'd reportedly killed 11 grizzlies throughout his life. Venturing into the frozen mountains was not an easy task. The men were not only risking the temperatures, they were surrounded by hostile Indian clans. In 1861, John had been cutting hay with a scythe when a band of 50 warriors encircled his location. They pitched camp on a bluff just above him and fired shots and yelled at him. John clearly had more guts than sense, as he simply walked right into the Indian camp, which went unheeded by the residents. He saw a pole draped with 7 scalps from white men, and John recognized 2 of them as being from his friends. The Powell family were Mormon settlers to the area who had fled Missouri a few years prior due to persecution. Escaping to the western wilderness, the Mormons sought out a place that would allow them to practice their faith without conflicting with other faiths, so they aimed their oxen and wagons toward Utah. The Powell boys and most people in this era were very resourceful and resilient. The winter deer hunting trip pushed the party to its limits, with plentiful snow and freezing temperatures. The men would camp out in the snow beneath the stars as the temperatures dropped and turned the ground as hard as concrete. One night Abraham was jolted awake after a fit during his sleep. A haunting and terrifying scenario had played out in his mind as he slumbered. He dreamt he was being attacked by a mysterious assailant. The villain had ripped open Abe's stomach and gashed him severely before he was startled from his sleep. In the morning, Abraham approached John and told him about his nightmare. John's response set Abe back a step or two, as he had also had a troubled night's rest. His brother indicated that he was burdened with a sense of impending doom and danger coming their way. The next day, John and Abraham were scouting the area for any sign of deer. John had walked to a point about 300 yards away from Abraham to look into the neighboring valley. As Abraham carefully slipped down the icy slope, he heard the sound of brush popping from a few yards away from him. Unbeknownst to Abraham, a massive grizzly boar had seen the hunters as they scouted and took up an ambush point, and Abraham had just walked right into the trap. The grizzly was on Abraham before he could cock and fire his hunting rifle. As John looked over the country, he heard his brother yell, "John! John!" He hurried back toward his brother and after several minutes stood over Abraham as he lay crumpled at the base of a standing dead pine tree. The sight of his brother's injuries was beyond what John could handle seeing. As John examined his brother, he noted that Abraham's scalp had been torn back from just beneath his eyes to the top of his head, essentially degloving his skull. His eyes dangled from their sockets and lay on his cheeks. John knew he couldn't spend a lot of time at the attack scene due to the grizzly's location was unknown to him. John pressed his brother's eyeballs back into their sockets and wrapped his shirt around Abraham's head to slow the bleeding. Abraham asked his brother to get his rifle, and he hurried to fulfill his brother's request.
After returning Abraham's rifle to him, John listened as Abraham described how the bear attacked him, then clawed and bit his rifle, trying to break it. John hefted his brother to his back and began the long hike back to camp. After an exhausting hike, John was able to lay his brother on his bedroll around 3 a.m. and began taking care of him. As he stripped his brother's clothes, he counted 47 different wounds imparted by the bear, covering nearly every part of his body. Abraham begged for water, so John filled his hat with snow and warmed it over the coals in the campfire. By morning, Abraham had drifted in and out of consciousness several times and seemed to be fading toward death. During one moment of clarity, Abraham asked John and Caleb to ordain him as an elder in the Mormon church and indicated he would die before sunrise. As the men watched over Abraham, they could see his life was slipping away. Just before breathing his last, he uttered, "Take care of Mother," before his head slumped to the side and his last breath left his body. The next summer, John returned to the area of Abraham's attack near Nebo Creek. He killed a large male grizzly bear there that he was sure was the one that had killed his brother. The huge bear stretched from corner to corner on a hay rack, which is defined as about 16 feet long and around 8 feet wide. In the 1800s, grizzly bears roamed much of the western United States, including the Wasatch Range of Utah. Grizzlies were known to be particularly aggressive when protecting food sources or territory. These bears typically weighed between 600 to 1,000 pounds, with males reaching up to 9 feet tall when standing on their hind legs. Regarding the bear's motives for attacking Abraham, it could be one of two causes. If the hunter stumbled into the bear and surprised it, then it could easily have been a defensive attack. But if the bear had laid up in an ambush position, then it was likely a predatory attack. There were no indications that a cached animal carcass or cubs were present at the time of the attack. Speaking of cubs, our Cub Tier membership on Patreon, linked below, will give you ad-free early access to our episodes, and the $3 per month goes a long way in helping me continue to produce educational and entertaining content like this. At the time, grizzly bears posed a frequent threat to settlers, hunters, and trappers. Grizzly bears in the American West often had large territories and relied on game, berries, and roots to survive, which occasionally brought them into direct conflict with humans. After reviewing the facts surrounding this episode, I'm left with a few questions for you. Did the grizzly lay in wait for the hunters, or was the attack a matter of Abraham being in the wrong place at the wrong time? Do you find it ironic that John had seen his friend's scalps on the poles of the Indians, and then saw his brother scalped by a grizzly bear? Had the bear been shot previously, and that is why it tried to break Abraham's rifle during the attack? I will gladly read and reply to your thoughts, so post them in the comments section below, and let's talk about it. Thank you for watching Scary Bear Attacks. If you've enjoyed this episode, please consider clicking on the like button and clicking on the bell icon. We'll help you know when we post our new episodes. Posting our video links to your social media profiles furthers awareness, and it's fun. We slashed our prices in our merch store, linked below, so check out the bargains there while you shop. As a member of our human community, remember to adventure bravely and be careful out there, especially in bear country.